Margaret Chen walked into the Ashford mansion on a grey Monday morning in late October, her cleaning supplies packed in a worn canvas bag that had seen better days, completely unaware that she would save a life before the week ended. The elderly woman lying in the master bedroom upstairs was dying, and every doctor in the country had already declared her case a medical mystery beyond their expertise. The mansion loomed before her, all stone and glass, speaking of wealth that most people couldn't comprehend in a lifetime of work. Victoria Ashford had been the picture of health until 8 months ago. At 73, she maintained an active lifestyle that put people half her age to shame, attended charity galas in designer gowns, managed her late husband's foundation with sharp precision, and walked 3 miles every morning through the estate's manicured grounds. Then came the headaches. Mild at first, easily dismissed as stress or the natural progression of age. Within weeks, she struggled to breathe during her morning walks. Her hands trembled uncontrollably when she tried to sign documents. Exhaustion pinned her to her bed for days at a time, a fatigue so profound that even speaking became an effort. Her son, William Ashford, watched his mother deteriorate with a helplessness that money couldn't fix, though he tried desperately to prove otherwise, throwing his considerable fortune at a problem that seemed to laugh at his wealth. William had built his fortune in pharmaceutical technology, a self-made billionaire who had turned a single patent into an empire. His company developed diagnostic tools used in hospitals worldwide, machines that could detect diseases in their earliest stages, save lives through early intervention. The irony of his mother's mysterious illness wasn't lost on him, and it ate at him daily. He assembled a medical team that read like a who's who of American medicine, sparing no expense. Neurologists from Johns Hopkins flew in to examine her. Pulmonologists from Mayo Clinic studied her breathing. Toxicologists from Stanford ran extensive screenings. They ran every test imaginable, some experimental procedures that cost more than most people earned in a year. MRIs revealed nothing. Blood work came back frustratingly normal. Genetic screenings showed no abnormalities. Organ function tests produced results that should have indicated a healthy woman. Victoria's body was shutting down anyway, and nobody could explain why, which made William furious in a way that few things in his controlled life ever had. The mansion itself stood as a monument to William's success and his father's before him. Perched on 15 acres in Connecticut's countryside, the estate featured imported marble from Italy, hand-carved woodwork from master craftsmen in Bavaria, and artwork worth millions hanging on walls that had hosted senators and celebrities. Victoria's bedroom occupied the entire East Wing's 2nd floor, a massive suite, overlooking manicured gardens that she could no longer enjoy, couldn't even see through the heavy curtains that remained perpetually drawn. The room had been her sanctuary for 30 years, filled with antique furniture collected during her travels across Europe with her late husband. A massive wardrobe from Vienna, dark walnut with intricate carvings. A writing desk from Paris, where she'd composed thousands of letters. Heavy velvet curtains from an English manor house that blocked out light and sound. William refused to move her from this room, insisting she needed the comfort of familiar surroundings during her illness, that disrupting her environment would only add stress to her fragile condition. Margaret had worked as a cleaner for 20 years, moving from one wealthy household to another, learning the rhythms and demands of the truly rich. She'd seen excess in every form imaginable, learned to move invisibly through spaces where her presence was barely acknowledged, where she existed as a function rather than a person. The Ashford job came through an agency after the previous cleaning service quit suddenly. The staff whispered about the dying woman upstairs, how uncomfortable it felt to work in a house shadowed by slow death, how the whole place felt heavy with grief and failure. Margaret needed the money desperately. Her daughter's college tuition didn't pay itself, and single mothers didn't have the luxury of turning down work because it felt uncomfortable. On her first day, Margaret met William briefly in his study, a room lined with first editions and awards from his company's innovations. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with grey touching his temples and expensive suits that couldn't hide his exhaustion or the weight he'd lost worrying about his mother. He gave her instructions with barely concealed impatience, his mind clearly elsewhere, probably on the latest round of test results or experimental treatment. The household staff consisted of a cook who prepared meals Victoria couldn't eat, a personal assistant who managed William's schedule and fielded calls from desperate relatives, and a rotating roster of medical professionals who came and went with increasing frequency. Everyone moved through the mansion with quiet efficiency, speaking in hushed tones, as if volume itself might disturb Victoria's fragile condition or somehow make the situation more real. Margaret's duties included the master bedroom, which she would clean daily. She climbed the stairs that first afternoon with her supplies, uncertain what to expect, having never worked in a house with someone actively dying. The room was dimmer than she anticipated, curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, creating a twilight atmosphere at 3 in the afternoon. Victoria lay in a hospital bed that seemed jarringly out of place among the antique elegance, modern medical equipment clashing with 19th century furniture. Oxygen tubes ran to her nose. Monitors beeped, softly, tracking vital signs that continued their steady decline despite every intervention. The old woman's breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort that made her whole body move. Her skin held a greyish pallor that Margaret recognized from her years working in nursing homes before switching to private residences, the colour of someone whose body was failing in fundamental ways. A nurse sat in the corner, scrolling through her phone with the bored expression of someone who'd seen this many times before. She barely acknowledged Margaret's entrance, didn't look up from whatever social media feed held her attention. Margaret began her work, dusting surfaces that already seemed clean, vacuuming carpets that showed no footprints because nobody walked here anymore. The room felt heavy, almost oppressive, the air itself seeming thick and difficult to breathe. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, though Margaret couldn't immediately identify what bothered her, what triggered the unease crawling up her spine. She worked methodically, as she'd been trained over 2 decades of professional cleaning. Attention to detail separated good cleaners from great ones, and Margaret prided herself on noticing things others missed. She noticed the medical equipment clustered near the bed, all state-of-the-art devices monitoring every bodily function, displaying numbers that meant nothing to her, but presumably told the doctors something. She noticed the medications lined up on the nightstand, bottles with names she couldn't pronounce, pills in every colour and size. She noticed the flowers, fresh and expensive, that nobody had thought to remove even as they wilted, their petals dropping onto the polished wood surface. But mostly, she noticed the smell. Not the antiseptic hospital scent she expected, but something earthier, mustier, like a basement that flooded every spring or an old cellar where things grew in darkness. Margaret had grown up in a small apartment in Queens, where her mother fought a constant battle against mold. New York's humidity created perfect conditions for it, especially in older buildings with poor ventilation. Her mother had suffered from respiratory problems her entire life, coughing and wheezing through Margaret's childhood, finally diagnosed with a severe mold allergy after years of misattributed symptoms and ineffective treatments. Margaret learned young to recognize the signs, the smell that others dismissed or didn't notice, the way moisture gathered in corners and along baseboards, the subtle discoloration on walls that others overlooked as shadows or aging paint. She'd developed an instinct for it, a sensitivity born from watching her mother suffer. She found herself studying Victoria's room with different eyes now, seeing it not as a wealthy woman's bedroom, but as an environment that might be causing harm. The heavy curtains that blocked natural light, and prevented air circulation. The antique furniture positioned against exterior walls where condensation could form. The ornate Persian rug that likely held decades of dust, moisture, and whatever grew in its fibers. This wasn't just a bedroom. It was a sealed environment where air barely moved, where expensive things took priority over practical considerations like ventilation and light. Old houses had problems that new money couldn't always fix, especially when people prioritized beauty over function. The massive wardrobe caught her attention immediately. It stood against the north wall, an impressive piece easily 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, commanding attention through sheer size and craftsmanship. Dark wood, intricately carved with scenes of hunting and harvest, probably weighing several hundred pounds, maybe close to 1,000. Margaret had seen similar pieces in other wealthy homes, beautiful but impractical, often creating dead spaces behind them where problems could hide for years. The wardrobe sat flush against the wall, or seemingly flush with no visible gap. But Margaret knew from experience that moving such pieces was nearly impossible, that they stayed in place for decades once positioned, that nobody thought to check behind them because the effort seemed too great for too little reason. She made a mental note but continued her work, aware that the nurse was watching her with mild suspicion, probably wondering why the new cleaner was staring at furniture instead of cleaning. Margaret finished her duties efficiently, left the room without comment, but the image of Victoria's labored breathing stayed with her through the evening, followed her home to Queen's, kept her awake that night, thinking about possibilities that nobody else seemed to be considering. The pattern continued through the week. Margaret cleaned the room daily, each visit reinforcing her suspicions. She watched Victoria's condition fluctuate in ways that seemed almost cyclical. Some days the old woman seemed slightly better, her breathing easier, her color less gray. Other days she could barely stay conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. The medical team rotated through with increasing desperation, running more tests, adjusting medications, consulting in hushed conferences outside the room. Margaret heard fragments of their conversations as she worked. Autoimmune disorders were mentioned. Environmental factors were briefly considered, then dismissed. Psychosomatic possibilities were raised, quickly shot down. They grasped at diagnoses that didn't quite fit, treating symptoms without understanding the cause, like mechanics replacing parts without understanding why the engine failed. Margaret's conviction grew stronger each day. The smell persisted despite her thorough cleaning, despite the air purifiers someone had installed. The air felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate to the sophisticated people around her, wrong in a way that her body recognized, even if her mind couldn't explain it. Scientifically, she began paying closer attention to Victoria's patterns, noting correlations that nobody else seemed to see. The old woman seemed consistently worse in the mornings after spending all night in the sealed room. She showed slight improvement after afternoon sessions in the sunroom downstairs, where light streamed through windows and fresh air circulated. But she declined again once returned to her bedroom for the night. Like clockwork, like cause and effect that everyone missed. Because they were looking for complex answers. Nobody else seemed to notice these correlations, too focused on complex medical explanations to see simple environmental patterns. The doctors discussed rare syndromes and genetic mutations. They debated experimental treatments and clinical trials. They consulted with specialists overseas, video conferences with experts in Tokyo and London, all while Victoria breathed toxic air in a room nobody thought to properly inspect, where a simple problem masqueraded as a medical mystery because wealth and expertise created assumptions about the impossibility of basic oversights. On Thursday morning, Margaret made her decision. She had to move the wardrobe, or at least look behind it. The logical part of her brain screamed that this was overstepping, that she could lose her job for rearranging a billionaire's antique furniture without permission, that she had no authority to make such decisions. But her gut insisted something was wrong behind. That massive piece, her instincts honed by decades of seeing what others missed. Years of experience told her that wealthy people often created problems through their attachment to expensive things, keeping furniture in place despite practical issues because moving it seemed impossible or disrespectful to its value, because the difficulty justified ignoring the problem. She waited until the nurse left for lunch, a 30-minute break that the woman took with religious regularity. Victoria dozed, fitfully, her breathing machine creating a rhythmic backdrop of mechanical assistance. Margaret approached the wardrobe with her heart pounding, running her hands along its sides, feeling for moisture or temperature changes. The wood felt cool and slightly damp to the touch, not the dry warmth of wood in a climate-controlled room. She positioned herself at one corner and pushed experimentally. The wardrobe didn't budge, even slightly. She tried again, throwing her full weight into it, using her legs for leverage. Nothing. The piece was too heavy, probably bolted to the wall for earthquake safety or insurance requirements, or simply too massive for one person to move, regardless of technique. Margaret stepped back, frustrated and running out of time before the nurse returned. She couldn't just leave it, not with her suspicions gnawing at her consciousness. She needed proof. Something concrete to show that her instincts weren't just the paranoid theories of an overcautious cleaner with childhood trauma about mold. She grabbed a flashlight from her supplies and knelt down, pressing her face close to the narrow gap between the wardrobe and the wall. The space was barely 2 inches, not enough to see clearly, but enough to shine light into the darkness behind and glimpse what had been hidden for years. What she saw made her stomach turn violently. The wall behind the wardrobe was black, not painted black, but covered in a thick, fuzzy darkness that could only be mold, spreading, like some malevolent organism. It stretched from floor to ceiling as far as she could see, covering several feet of surface area at least. The growth looked old, well-established, thriving in the dark, damp space where nobody had looked for 3 decades. Margaret recognized it immediately as toxic black mold, the kind that released spores continuously into the air that caused respiratory problems, neurological symptoms, chronic fatigue, and progressive illness when exposure continued long, enough without intervention. She sat back on her heels, heart racing with the implications. This was it. This was killing Victoria Ashford. Not some rare disease or mysterious syndrome that required specialist diagnosis, but simple environmental poisoning that a first-year medical student should have caught. The old woman had spent decades sleeping feet away from this colony, breathing in its spores every night, every morning, accumulating toxins in her system. The room's poor ventilation made it worse. The heavy curtains preventing sunlight that might have slowed the growth, the expensive but impractical design choices creating perfect conditions for the mold to flourish, completely undetected while everyone looked elsewhere for answers. Margaret stood up, her mind racing through implications and consequences. She needed to tell someone immediately, but who would listen to her? The medical team had already dismissed environmental factors after cursory examination, too confident in their expertise to consider that they'd missed something obvious. William was surrounded by experts telling him his mother had an incurable condition, that he should prepare for the worst, start thinking about end-of-life care. She was a cleaner making an accusation that would sound absurd without proof. Challenging diagnoses from doctors whose credentials filled walls, whose opinions shaped medical literature. She needed evidence, something undeniable that couldn't be dismissed as the observations of someone without proper training or education. She spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything she could with methodical precision, She took photos with her phone, dozens of them, capturing the mold visible through the gap, the discoloration on the baseboard where moisture had wicked upward, the slight warping of the wood where dampness had taken hold over years. She measured the temperature and humidity in different parts of the room, using a simple device she'd bought years ago for her own apartment, noting how the corner near the wardrobe was noticeably cooler and significantly damper than the rest of the space. She checked other walls and furniture throughout the room, confirming that this was the only area with visible growth, that the problem was localized but severe. The evidence mounted, creating a clear picture of long-term toxic exposure that matched Victoria's symptoms perfectly if anyone cared to look objectively. When William returned that evening, Margaret was waiting in the hallway outside Victoria's room. She caught him before he could enter, her phone clutched in her hand, determination overriding her nervousness, and the voice in her head saying this was career suicide. He looked annoyed at first, clearly uninterested in whatever household issue she wanted to discuss, probably assuming she needed approval for cleaning supplies or had questions about her schedule. But something in her expression made him stop, made him actually look at her instead of through her, the way employers often did with household staff. Margaret showed him the photos, explaining what she'd found while keeping her voice steady despite his initial skepticism and visible impatience. She told him about her mother's mold allergy, how the symptoms matched Victoria's perfectly, symptom by symptom. She pointed out the correlations between Victoria's condition and her time spent in the room versus time spent elsewhere in the house. She explained about toxic, black mold, about spore exposure, about how environmental poisoning could mimic dozens of diseases, how easily it was missed when people weren't looking for it. She made her case methodically, presenting facts rather than theories, letting the evidence speak for itself rather than asking him to trust her judgment over his expensive medical team. William's expression shifted from dismissive to uncertain to genuinely alarmed as he looked at the photos, as her words penetrated his grief and exhaustion. He called his personal assistant immediately, then the lead physician, his voice sharp with anger and dawning horror. Within an hour, the room was full of people examining the wardrobe, confirming Margaret's discovery with instruments and expertise. A mold remediation specialist arrived by evening, called in from a company 2 hours away, taking samples that would later confirm the presence of Stachybotrys chartarum, one of the most toxic mold species known, in concentrations that exceeded dangerous levels by a factor of 10 or more. The decision to move Victoria came immediately, without debate or delay. William had her transferred to a guest suite on the opposite side of the mansion that night, away from the contaminated area, to a room with windows that opened and air that didn't carry poison. The medical team adjusted their approach dramatically, treating her now for mold poisoning rather than mystery illness, protocols that actually addressed the cause. The change in her condition was remarkable, almost miraculous in speed. Within 48 hours, Victoria's breathing improved noticeably, the rasping quality diminishing. The tremors in her hands decreased significantly. Her color began to return, the grey pallor fading. By the end of the week, she was sitting up independently, eating solid food, speaking in full sentences for the first time in months, asking questions about what had happened, expressing disbelief that the answer had been so simple. The mansion underwent extensive remediation that would take months to complete properly. The wardrobe was removed carefully, revealing the full, horrifying extent of the damage behind it. The entire wall had to be torn out and rebuilt from studs outward, the contamination having penetrated deep into the structure. Air quality tests throughout the estate uncovered additional problem areas, all related to poor ventilation and moisture control in the historic structure that nobody had properly maintained because the house itself was considered perfect, untouchable. William watched the demolition with something close to shock, unable to comprehend how something so simple, so preventable, had nearly killed his mother while he spent millions on ineffective treatments that addressed phantom problems, chasing diagnoses that didn't exist while ignoring the poison she breathed daily. Victoria's recovery continued steadily over the following months. The toxic exposure had caused real damage to her respiratory system and nervous system that would take time to heal completely, but the prognosis shifted from terminal to optimistic, from hospice care to rehabilitation. Her cognitive function returned fully, the mental fog lifting. Her lungs cleared progressively. The mysterious symptoms that had baffled specialists resolved one by one once the source of poisoning was removed, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place retroactively. The medical team ran new tests with fresh understanding, now knowing what they were treating, providing targeted care that actually addressed the problem rather than symptoms, prescribing treatments that supported her body's natural recovery rather than fighting phantom diseases. William's response evolved through stages from relief to anger to profound humility that changed him fundamentally. He fired the medical team that had missed such an obvious environmental cause, furious at their failure to conduct basic due diligence, to ask simple questions, to look beyond complex diagnoses. He commissioned a full investigation into how the mold problem had gone undetected for so long, discovering that previous staff had reported moisture issues years ago but been ignored because fixing them would have required moving valuable furniture or disrupting the room's aesthetic. The house itself had been prioritized over the health of its inhabitants, aesthetic choices valued above practical safety considerations, wealth creating blind spots that nearly proved fatal. Margaret continued working at the mansion, but her role changed fundamentally and immediately. William sought her input on household decisions regularly, valuing her practical perspective over expensive consultants who spoke in jargon without substance, who provided impressive reports but missed obvious problems. He increased her salary significantly, tripled it without negotiation. He added her daughter's entire college tuition to the household budget as a performance bonus, removing Margaret's primary financial stress. More importantly, he listened to her in ways that went beyond employer-employee dynamics, recognizing that real wisdom often came from unexpected sources, that expertise existed outside formal credentials, that sometimes the people closest to problems saw solutions that experts missed because they were too close to complexity. Victoria, once recovered enough to understand fully what had happened, insisted on meeting properly with Margaret, not as employer and employee, but as one woman to another. The two women sat in the renovated East Wing months later, now bright with natural light streaming through opened curtains and proper ventilation humming invisibly behind walls. Victoria held Margaret's hands across a small table, tears in her eyes, struggling to express gratitude that seemed impossible to adequately convey with mere words. Margaret had saved her life by simply paying attention, by trusting her instincts when everyone else dismissed practical explanations in favor of complex theories, by having the courage to speak up despite every social and professional pressure to remain silent in her place. The story spread through William's social circles quickly, becoming a cautionary tale about pride and assumptions and the dangers of wealth, creating distance from practical reality. Other wealthy families began examining their own historic homes, discovering similar issues that had been overlooked or ignored. For generations, the medical community took note, reminded that environmental factors deserved thorough investigation before exotic diagnoses, that sometimes the simplest explanation was correct, even when it seemed too obvious. Margaret received requests from other households, her reputation as someone who actually looked at what was in front of her becoming valuable in ways she never anticipated, transforming her from invisible household staff into sought-after consultant. Williams. Transformation went deeper than gratitude or recognition. The experience shattered his confidence in expensive solutions, forcing him to recognize how his wealth had created blind spots in his thinking, how surrounding himself with impressive credentials had actually made him more vulnerable to missing obvious answers. He had assumed that money could solve any problem, that the best doctors and most advanced technology would naturally provide answers, that expertise was always superior to common sense. Instead, the solution had come from someone paid to clean floors, someone whose expertise lay in noticing what others overlooked because they considered it beneath their attention or outside their specialization. He established a foundation in his mother's name, focused on environmental health and mold awareness in residential settings, particularly in low-income housing where the problem was endemic but ignored. The organization provided free testing for families who couldn't afford, private inspections, educated doctors on environmental factors in mystery illnesses through continuing education programs, and advocated for building standards that prioritized health over aesthetics or cost savings. Margaret helped design the programs personally, her practical knowledge shaping initiatives that actually addressed real problems rather than theoretical ones, creating change that would prevent others from suffering what Victoria had endured. Years later, Victoria celebrated her 80th birthday in the mansion's gardens, surrounded by family and friends who had thought they'd never see this day, who had already begun grieving her loss. Margaret stood beside her throughout the celebration, no longer just the cleaner, but a trusted friend whose attention to detail had given them all these additional years together, whose courage to speak up had changed everything. The massive wardrobe had been donated to a museum after proper treatment and restoration, carrying a plaque that told its story as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats hide in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to look behind the expensive furniture and question what everyone else accepts without investigation or thought.